If you can dance this tango without embarrassing yourself, I'll marry you right here, right now." Richard Sterling's words sliced through the Manhattan penthouse like shattered crystal, his champagne flute frozen mid-toast as 300 elite guests erupted in cruel laughter. What they didn't know was they were watching a predator mock her own master. Amara Jackson stood motionless in the center of the marble floor, her server's uniform soaked with Dom Perignon. Every iPhone camera trained on her dark face like spotlights on an execution stage. The Steinway's tango melody seemed to mock her poverty, her race, her desperation. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore gasped audibly from the Chanel-clad crowd. "Richard, that's barbaric, even for you." But her protest was drowned by anticipatory whispers and the soft buzz of live streams beginning. Amara's calloused fingers slowly untied her sensible work shoes. She needed exactly $50,000 by tomorrow morning, or everything she'd fought to protect would disappear forever. The billionaire had no idea he'd just challenged Lincoln Center's former prima ballerina to dance. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Sterling Industries Charity Gala represented everything Amara Jackson had once belonged to and everything she'd lost. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors that had witnessed decades of Manhattan's elite making deals that shaped the world. Tonight, those same floors bore witness to her humiliation. Amara had arrived at 5 p.m. through the service entrance of the Fifth Avenue penthouse, her server's uniform pressed to perfection despite being mended 3 times. The navy polyester was a stark contrast to the Valentino gowns and Tom Ford tuxedos swirling around her. She moved like a ghost among the powerful, invisible until she wasn't. The irony wasn't lost on her that tonight's cause was veteran families. Marcus would have found it darkly amusing that his widow was serving champagne to raise money for people like herself. But Marcus wasn't here anymore, hadn't been for 3 years, and the Army death benefits had run out long ago. Richard Sterling commanded the room from the moment he entered. At 48, he possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having heard the word "no" applied to him personally. His Armani tuxedo fit like liquid obsidian, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. Those same eyes had tracked Amara's movements throughout the evening, though she couldn't fathom why. The accident had been inevitable, really. Carrying a tray of Dom Perignon through a crowd of gesticulating billionaires while calculating how many hours she'd need to work to pay Sophie's college application fees. The crystal flutes had seemed to suspend in air for a moment before gravity claimed them, sending $1,500 worth of champagne across Sterling's chest. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 conversations ceased, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Amara's hands trembled as she knelt to collect the shattered crystal, each piece reflecting her fractured dreams back at her. "Clumsy doesn't begin to cover it." Sterling's voice cut through the silence like a blade. 3 years you've worked these events and you still can't manage basic coordination. The crowd's laughter was sharp, predatory. These people who wrote checks for veteran charities were now entertained by one veteran's widow being humiliated. Amara felt each laugh like a physical blow, but she kept her eyes down, kept collecting glass. That's when the tango began. Someone had started the music, Por una cabeza, the same piece she'd danced to win the national championship 15 years ago. The melody rose like a ghost from her past, and she felt her body respond instinctively, muscle memory awakening from its enforced sleep. Sterling heard it too. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that he couldn't quite place. The music seemed to challenge him, and Richard Sterling never backed down from a challenge. "Tell you what," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly attentive crowd. "Let's make this interesting." And that's when he made the bet that would change everything. The champagne dripped from Richard Sterling's $1,000 shirt like golden tears, each drop marking the seconds that stretched into eternity. The penthouse had transformed into a coliseum, 300 smartphones raised like modern-day thumbs, deciding her fate. Amara remained on her knees among the crystal shards, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered comment cutting deeper than the glass beneath her palms. $50,000, Sterling announced, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who spent more on lunch. If you can dance this tango without making a complete fool of yourself, the money's yours. He gestured toward the small dance floor where the Argentine quartet continued their haunting melody. But when you embarrass yourself, and you will, I want a public apology to every person in this room for wasting our time. The crowd's anticipation was electric. Mrs. Whitmore covered her mouth in horror. Richard, this is unconscionable. But her protest was lost in the buzz of excitement as guests began placing side bets. The live streams multiplied, hashtags already trending. Hashtag billionaire bet, tango challenge, servant dance. Amara's mind raced through desperate calculations. $50,000 would cover Sophie's first year at Columbia, her own medical treatment, 6 months of rent. It was exactly what she needed to keep her 17-year-old daughter from throwing away her Harvard acceptance to work at McDonald's. The sum wasn't coincidental. Sterling had researched her, knew exactly how much desperation cost. "I need to know the terms," she said quietly, still kneeling but looking up at him for the first time. Her voice carried a dignity that surprised the room. Several guests leaned forward, straining to hear. Sterling's smile was predatory. "Simple. Dance one complete tango. If I'm impressed, genuinely impressed, you get the money. If you humiliate yourself, you apologize to everyone here and admit that people like you should know their place." The racial undertone wasn't subtle. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some uncomfortable, others excited by the spectacle. Amara felt the familiar weight of being the only black face in a sea of white privilege, the burden of representing her entire race in their eyes. "People like me," she repeated, letting the words hang in the air. She slowly rose to her feet, her movements fluid despite the trembling in her hands. "And what exactly do you know about people like me, Mr. Sterling?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected groveling, pleading, perhaps tears. Not this quiet challenge that made several guests shift uncomfortably. "I know you've been serving at these events for 3 years. I know you live in a studio apartment in the Bronx. I know your husband was a soldier who couldn't handle civilian life." The last comment was a bridge too far. Gasps echoed across the room as Amara's composure cracked for just a moment, pain flashing across her features before she regained control. Marcus's death wasn't something to be weaponized for entertainment. "My husband," she said softly, "was a decorated Army Ranger who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He saved 17 lives in Kandahar before his convoy hit an IED. He came home with PTSD and nightmares, and when the VA failed him, he made a permanent decision to a temporary problem." Her voice never wavered, but tears glistened in her eyes. "He was worth 100 of anyone in this room." The silence was deafening. Even Sterling seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, his jaw tightening as several guests looked away in shame. The live stream comments were exploding with outrage at his cruelty, but also with growing support for the woman standing with such dignity in the face of his assault. Amara wiped her hands on her uniform, leaving small blood stains from the crystal cuts. "I accept your terms, Mr. Sterling, but I want to add one of my own. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. When I impress you, not if, when, you'll double the amount, 100,000, and you'll donate another 100,000 to the Marcus Jackson Veterans Memorial Fund." The audacity of it stunned the room. A server, A woman who'd just been humiliated was not only accepting the challenge but raising the stakes. Sterling's face darkened with anger, and something else, a flicker of respect he didn't want to acknowledge. "Done," he said coldly. "But when you fail, you'll also admit that affirmative action and handouts have made people like you think you deserve what you haven't earned." This time, Amara smiled. It wasn't the servile expression she'd worn while serving drinks. It was something else entirely. Confident. Almost predatory. She kicked off her sensible black shoes, her bare feet connecting with the cold marble. The moment they touched the floor, something fundamental shifted in her posture, her bearing, her entire presence. The tango music swelled and Amara Jackson began to move. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. The moment Amara's bare feet touched the marble floor, every pretense of servility evaporated. Her spine straightened with regal authority, her shoulders squared with military precision, and her chin lifted with the confidence of someone who had once commanded standing ovations from Lincoln Center's most discerning audiences. The gasps began immediately. Mrs. Whitmore's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor in an echo of the earlier accident. "My God," she whispered, her hand pressed to her throat. "Look at her posture." 300 smartphones captured the moment a servant became a queen. The live stream comments exploded as viewers witnessed the metamorphosis in real time. The woman who had been invisible moments before now commanded every eye in the room with magnetic authority. Sterling's confident smirk faltered as Amara began to move. These weren't the tentative steps of someone attempting to dance above their station. These were the controlled, precise movements of a master returning to her domain. Her arms rose with liquid grace, finding the traditional Argentine tango position even without a partner, her body swaying to the haunting melody with intimate familiarity. The first walking steps, caminadas, were executed with such perfection that several guests audibly gasped. Her bare feet caressed the marble like old lovers reuniting, each placement deliberate and sensual. The music seemed to respond to her movement, the bandoneon's melancholy voice weaving around her like silk. "This is impossible," Sterling muttered, his face draining of color. "She's just a what?" Dr. Patricia Morgan, director of the Metropolitan Opera, stepped forward from the crowd. "That, my dear Richard, is professional technique. Look at her porte de bras, her épaulement. That's not something you learn watching YouTube videos." As if responding to the challenge, Amara executed a series of ochos, figure-8 movements that required years of training to master. Her hips rolled with the precision of a Swiss watch, her torso maintaining perfect isolation while her legs traced intricate patterns across the floor. The crowd fell into stunned silence, broken only by the whispered prayers of the tango music. Sterling's jaw clenched as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. This wasn't desperation driving amateur movements. This was artistry, pure and devastating. The woman he had sought to humiliate was systematically destroying his assumptions with every breath, every step, every perfectly controlled gesture. Young Sophie Chen, a Columbia journalism student working the event's social media, was frantically typing on her phone. "Guys, this is insane. #Tango Queen is trending worldwide. Twitter's melting down. Someone just identified her. Amara Jackson, former Lincoln Center prima ballerina." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Whispered confirmation spread from guest to guest as Google searches confirmed what their eyes were witnessing. She was principal dancer for 8 years. Won the national championship in 2009. Performed at Kennedy Center for 3 presidents. Sterling's hands began to tremble. The woman he had been torturing for 3 years, the invisible servant he had treated with casual cruelty, was a celebrated artist who had graced the world's most prestigious stages. The irony was crushing. He had been humiliating someone infinitely more accomplished than anyone in his audience. But Amara wasn't finished. She moved into a series of ganchos, leg hooks that required absolute mastery of balance and timing. Each movement told a story of loss, resilience, and quiet dignity maintained in the face of unspeakable hardship. This wasn't just dancing. It was autobiography written in motion. The music began to build toward its crescendo, and Amara's movements intensified accordingly. She was no longer dancing for $50,000 or for dignity or even for revenge. She was dancing for Marcus, for Sophie, for every invisible person who had ever been dismissed by those who confused wealth with worth. Sterling realized with growing horror that he had not simply lost a bet, he had lost everything. The video went viral within 18 minutes. By the time Amara finished her final pose, a perfect balance on one foot, arms extended like wings against the backdrop of Manhattan's glittering skyline, Tango Queen had exploded across every social media platform on Earth. The penthouse had become ground zero for a cultural earthquake that would reshape how America talked about class, race, and hidden talent. But viral fame came with a price that Amara discovered the next morning when she arrived at her regular cleaning job at the Meridian Hotel. The manager, Carl Rodriguez, was waiting in the service corridor with an expression that mixed embarrassment and inevitability. "Amara, we need to talk." He avoided her eyes, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "Corporate called this morning. They're letting you go." The words hit her like ice water. "Because of last night?" "They said you violated the terms of your employment by bringing negative attention to clients we service. The Sterling account specifically requested." He stopped, finally meeting her gaze. "Jesus, Amara, I had no idea. 23 years I've been managing these events, and I never knew you were, Lincoln Center?" She collected her final paycheck in silence, the sum pathetically small compared to the viral millions who had watched her dance. $57.38 for 4 days of work. Her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, brand partnership offers, and 1,000 variations of "your story is so inspiring," but inspiration didn't pay rent. The Bronx studio apartment felt even smaller when she returned home to find Sophie waiting with her laptop open, tears streaming down her 17-year-old face. Her daughter looked exactly like Marcus had at that age, the same determined jaw, the same eyes that saw too much, too young. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" Sophie's voice cracked. "All these years I thought you were just..." "Just what, baby?" Amara sank into the threadbare armchair, exhaustion settling into her bones like winter. "I don't know. Ordinary. But you're extraordinary. And you've been hiding it from everyone, including me." Sophie turned the laptop screen toward her mother. The video had been viewed 47 million times, with comments in dozens of languages. "Look at this. People are calling you a goddess, an inspiration, a queen. But I know the truth none of them know." Amara's stomach clenched. "What truth?" "That you're sick." Sophie's voice broke completely. "I found the medical bills you've been hiding. Stage 2 breast cancer, the insurance denials, the payment plans you can't afford. You danced for that money because you're dying, aren't you?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither of them could extinguish. Amara reached for her daughter, but Sophie pulled away. "How long have you known?" Amara whispered. 6 weeks. I followed you to the oncologist appointment when you said you were going to a job interview." Sophie wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I heard them talking about treatment options and how much time you might have if you don't start chemotherapy soon." Meanwhile, across town in a corner office overlooking Central Park, Richard Sterling was having the worst morning of his professional life. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m., and none of the calls were congratulatory. The board of directors had convened an emergency meeting. 3 major clients had already canceled contracts. The PR department was in full crisis mode. "Richard, you have to understand," his longtime publicist, Janet Morrison, paced across his Persian rug like a caged tiger. "This isn't just bad publicity. This is career-ending stuff. You humiliated a cancer patient on live television, a widow, a decorated veteran's wife, someone who was already more accomplished than anyone in that room." The irony wasn't lost on him. Sterling Industries had built its fortune on image management, on carefully curated narratives of success and philanthropy. Now he was the villain in a story watched by half the planet. His assistant knocked tentatively. "Mr. Sterling, there's a young woman here to see you. Says her name is Sophie Jackson." Sterling's blood ran cold. He'd researched Amara obsessively through the night, learning details that made his cruelty seem even more monstrous. The daughter was 17, Harvard-bound, working 3 part-time jobs to help with expenses while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. Sophie entered his office with the kind of composure that comes from growing up too fast. She wore her school uniform, a modest plaid skirt and white blouse from PS 184 in the Bronx, but carried herself with dignity that put his designer suits to shame. "Mr. Sterling." She didn't sit when he gestured to a chair. "I came to collect the money you owe my mother." "I haven't forgotten the bet, Miss Jackson. The funds are being prepared." 200,000. Sophie interrupted. "You doubled the stakes when she accepted your terms, but that's not why I'm here." Sterling waited, unsettled by her directness. "I'm here to tell you something about my mother that your research probably missed." Sophie's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "She's dying. Stage 2 breast cancer, diagnosed 3 months ago. The insurance company, which, by the way, is owned by one of your subsidiary companies, denied her claim on a technicality." The words hit him like physical blows. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't, because you never bothered to see her as human." Sophie stepped closer to his desk. "She took that humiliation, accepted your cruel bet, risked her dignity in front of 300 people and millions of viewers, because she needs money for treatment, and to make sure I can go to college even if she doesn't survive." Sterling's hands began to shake. The woman he'd tormented was fighting for her life, and he'd unknowingly weaponized the very system denying her care. "But here's what you really don't understand," Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength. "My mother didn't dance for your money last night. She danced to show the world that people like us, people you step on every day, have value, have stories, have dreams that matter." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sterling realized he was staring at his own reflection in the window, seeing clearly for the first time in years the man he'd become. Cruel. Isolated. Using wealth as a weapon against people who deserved better. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "I want you to understand that when you humiliate people for sport, you're not just hurting them, you're killing something beautiful in the world." Sophie turned toward the door, then paused. "My father used to say that how we treat people who can't help us says everything about who we really are. Last night, you showed 300 people and 47 million viewers exactly who you are." As the door closed behind her, Sterling was left alone with the weight of his actions and a growing realization that Amara Jackson's dance had revealed more than just hidden talent. It had exposed the hollow cruelty of his own soul, and the question that would haunt him was whether someone like him could ever deserve forgiveness from someone like her. The viral sensation continued to grow, but behind the screens and hashtags, two families were grappling with truths that no amount of internet fame could resolve. 3 weeks after the viral video, Richard Sterling stood outside Mount Sinai Hospital at 2 in the morning, rain soaking through his $1,000 coat. He'd been coming here every night since Sophie's visit, never finding the courage to go inside. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of what he'd learned had become unbearable. The oncology ward was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and muffled conversations behind closed doors. He found room 314 and stopped, his hand frozen on the door handle. Through the small window he could see Amara sleeping fitfully, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that couldn't quite hide the effects of chemotherapy. Sophie sat beside her, textbooks spread across the tiny table, trying to study for her SATs while keeping vigil. "She's been here for 6 days, a voice said behind him. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending oncologist, approached with a chart in her hands. Complications from the treatment. Her body was already weakened from malnutrition and stress. The insurance situation isn't helping. Sterling's throat constricted. Will she survive? That depends on a lot of factors. Access to consistent treatment being the primary one. Dr. Chen studied him with the direct gaze of someone who'd seen too much human suffering to waste time on pleasantries. You're the man from the video. It wasn't a question. Sterling nodded, shame burning in his chest like acid. That young woman in there has been dancing since she was 4 years old. Her grandmother saved for 2 years to buy her first pair of real dance shoes. Dr. Chen's voice was clinically calm, but her words cut like surgical instruments. She earned a full scholarship to Juilliard, then Lincoln Center. Met her husband at a USO show where she was performing for troops before deployment. You know what she told me when they brought her in? Sterling couldn't speak. She said she was grateful the video went viral because now Sophie would have something to remember her by, something to be proud of. Dr. Chen closed the chart with a snap. That's who you tried to destroy for entertainment. Inside the room, Sophie looked up as if sensing their presence. She carefully extracted herself from her mother's grip and stepped into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind her. Mr. Sterling? Her voice was hoarse with exhaustion. I didn't expect to see you here. I've been coming every night. I couldn't. He struggled for words that felt inadequate. How is she? Dying, Sophie said simply. The chemotherapy is working, but slowly, and every day she can't work is another day we fall further behind. The medical bills are destroying what's left of our savings. Sterling pulled an envelope from his jacket. The money from the bet. I should have brought it sooner. Sophie took the envelope but didn't open it. This won't be enough, not for everything she needs. Then what will be? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sophie studied his face, searching for something she wasn't sure existed. Why are you really here, Mr. Sterling? The truth, when it came, surprised him. Because I don't know who I am anymore. I spent 30 years building walls to protect myself from being hurt the way I was hurt as a child. But somewhere along the way, I became the person who hurts others. Sophie's expression softened slightly. What happened to you? Sterling leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling every one of his 48 years. My mother left when I was 8. She was a lot like your mother, actually. Beautiful, talented, proud. But she had demons she couldn't overcome. Addiction, depression. She chose drugs over staying with me and my father. That must have been devastating. My father made sure it was. He spent the next 10 years telling me that abandonment was in my nature, that people like her, like us, couldn't be trusted, that the only way to avoid being left was to never let anyone close enough to leave. Sterling's voice cracked. I think I've been punishing every black woman I've met for what she did to me." The confession hung in the hospital air like a prayer for absolution. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing the complexity of pain begetting pain. "My mother never told me much about my father's deployments," she said finally. "But I know he came back different, angry, scared. He took it out on himself instead of others. But the result was the same. Trauma has to go somewhere." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Sterling said quickly. "I don't deserve it. But I want to do something real. Not just money to ease my guilt." Sophie looked through the window at her sleeping mother. "There is something. But it would mean more than just writing a check." "What?" "My mother's insurance was denied because the treatment is considered experimental. But if someone with influence made some calls, applied the right pressure—" Sophie met his eyes. "Your company owns significant shares in the insurance provider. You could override the denial." Sterling felt something shift inside his chest. "Consider it done. And there's more. The community center where my mother first learned to dance is being shut down. Gentrification. The building's being converted to luxury condos. 300 kids will lose their after-school programs." "How much would it cost to save it?" "2 million. Maybe 3 for renovations." Sterling didn't hesitate. "Done." Sophie's eyes widened. "Just like that?" "I have more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes. It's time I use some of it to build something instead of tearing people down." He paused, then asked the question that had been haunting him. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" "I think," Sophie said carefully, "that my mother has spent her whole life believing people are basically good, even when they give her every reason to believe otherwise. But forgiveness isn't the same as trust, and trust has to be earned." The door opened softly, and Amara appeared, leaning heavily against the frame. The scarf had slipped, revealing the smooth curve of her scalp where her hair had once been. She looked fragile in a way that made Sterling's chest ache. But her eyes still held that quiet strength that had captivated millions. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie told me you've been coming by." "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling pathetically inadequate. "For everything. For not seeing you. For not knowing. For being cruel when you were already suffering." Amara studied him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to measure words like medicine. "Do you know what the hardest part of the last 3 years has been?" Sterling shook his head. "Not the poverty, not even Marcus's death. It was becoming invisible, having people look through me as if I didn't exist, as if my dreams, my past, my pain didn't matter because of what uniform I wore." The words hit him like physical blows. "But you know what I learned dancing that night?" Amara's voice grew stronger. "That we're all just people trying to find grace under pressure. Even you." The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning that felt like the end of the world. Dr. Chen's words floated through the sterile air of the consultation room like debris from an explosion. "The cancer has spread to the lymph nodes. Stage 3. We need to discuss more aggressive treatment options." Amara sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable chair, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she'd maintained through 3 years of humiliation, through Marcus's funeral, through every devastating blow life had delivered. But inside, something was crumbling. "What does that mean?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. At 17, she'd already witnessed more loss than most people faced in a lifetime. But this was different. This was her mother, her anchor, the one constant in a world that had taken everything else. "It means we're looking at 8 months of intensive chemotherapy, possibly radiation. The treatment will be difficult, Doctor." Chen's clinical language couldn't soften the brutal reality. Without insurance coverage, the cost could reach $400,000. The number hung in the room like a death sentence. Even with Sterling's bet money and the viral video's unexpected opportunities, it might as well have been $4 million. Amara felt the familiar weight of impossible choices pressing down on her chest. There are clinical trials, Dr. Chen continued, but the waiting lists are long and qualification requirements are strict. I have to be honest with you, time is not on our side. After the appointment, mother and daughter sat in the hospital cafeteria, picking at food neither could taste. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly pallor that matched Amara's complexion since the chemo had begun. "Mom," Sophie's voice carried the forced strength of someone trying to hold together when everything was falling apart. "We'll figure this out. The GoFundMe is up to $60,000. The interviews you've been doing, the dance schools wanting you to teach." "Baby." Amara reached across the table, covering her daughter's hand with her own. Her fingers were thin now, skeletal, the wedding ring Marcus had placed there 15 years ago spinning loosely. "I need you to understand something. No matter what happens to me, you're going to Columbia. You're going to become that doctor you've dreamed of being since you were 7 years old." "Not without you, I'm not." The words broke something in Amara that had been barely holding together. She'd spent 3 years being strong, being invisible, being whatever everyone needed her to be. But watching her daughter sacrifice her future out of love and loyalty was a burden she couldn't bear. That evening, alone in their Bronx apartment, Amara made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. She called the number Richard Sterling had given her at the hospital. "I need to see you," she said when he answered. "Tonight." They met at Riverside Park near the memorial bench where she sometimes came to feel close to Marcus. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. Sterling arrived looking haggard, his usual polished appearance replaced by something more human and vulnerable. "The cancer has spread," she said without preamble. "I'm dying, Richard. Really dying this time." He'd been researching experimental treatments obsessively since learning of her diagnosis, calling in favors from medical school connections, exploring every possible avenue. But the look on her face told him she hadn't called him here to discuss treatment options. "What do you need?" he asked simply. "I need you to promise me something." Amara turned to face him fully, her dark eyes holding a depth of pain that made his chest ache. "When I'm gone, I need you to look after Sophie, not with money, though she'll need help with college. I need you to see her." "The way you never saw me." "You're not going anywhere," Sterling said fiercely. "I've found 3 clinical trials, 2 in Europe that show promising results. We can fly to Switzerland next week. Stop." The word cut through his desperate planning like a blade. "I appreciate everything you're trying to do. The insurance coverage, the community center, all of it. But I need you to hear what I'm actually saying." Sterling's hands were shaking. In the weeks since the hospital encounter, something fundamental had shifted in him. The walls he'd built to protect himself from caring had crumbled, leaving him vulnerable to a kind of pain he hadn't felt since childhood. "I can't lose you, too," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Not when I've just found you." The raw honesty in his voice made Amara's composure crack. She'd spent so many years being strong for everyone else that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, to matter to someone in a way that transcended obligation or duty. "You didn't find me, Richard. I was always here. You just finally learned to see." A group of teenagers skateboarded past, their laughter echoing off the river. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played jazz that drifted through the evening air like smoke. Life continued around them, beautiful and mundane and precious in its ordinariness. "There's something else," Amara said quietly. "Something I need to tell you about your mother." Sterling's body went rigid. In all their conversations, she'd never mentioned the connection Sophie had revealed during their first encounter. Sarah Mae Washington. The name fell from Amara's lips like a prayer. She taught me everything I know about tango, about grace under pressure, about finding beauty in the midst of pain. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sterling gripped the park bench until his knuckles went white, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to process. That's impossible. She used to say that tango was like life. You had to trust your partner completely, even when you couldn't see where the dance was leading. Amara's voice carried the weight of memory and loss. She talked about her little boy sometimes, how much she missed him, how she hoped someday he'd understand that leaving him was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but that she was too broken to stay. Sterling felt tears he hadn't shed in 30 years, burning behind his eyes. She abandoned me. She was 19 years old, addicted to heroin and drowning in depression she didn't have words for. She left you because she loved you too much to watch herself destroy you. Amara's voice was gentle but unflinching. She died trying to get clean, trying to become worthy of coming back to you. The truth hit him like a physical blow, shattering decades of carefully constructed narrative about abandonment and unworthiness. Everything he'd built his adult life around, the walls, the cruelty, the need to hurt before being hurt, had been founded on a fundamental misunderstanding. I became everything she was trying to protect me from, he realized, his voice breaking. But you can choose to become something different. That's what she would have wanted, what she died hoping for. As night fell over the river, two broken people sat together on a park bench, sharing the weight of truths that had taken a lifetime to surface. The revelation about his mother changed everything, but it was the discovery 3 days later that shattered Richard Sterling's world completely. The private investigator's report landed on his desk at 9:47 a.m., a manila envelope containing photographs, medical records, and insurance claim documents that painted a picture of corporate cruelty so systematic it took his breath away. Sterling Industries didn't just own shares in Meridian Health Insurance. They controlled it. And Meridian Health had been systematically denying cancer treatment claims for single mothers, veterans' widows, and minority women for over 5 years. The algorithm was brutal in its efficiency. Target the most vulnerable populations, delay approval until treatment windows closed, force patients into financial ruin, then offer settlements that were fractions of the original claim amounts. Amara Jackson wasn't just one victim. She was victim number 1,247. The files spread across his mahogany desk told stories that made him physically sick. Maria Santos, 34, died of cervical cancer while fighting a claim denial for 15 months. Jennifer Washington, 29, lost her house and custody of her children when bankruptcy followed her husband's denied leukemia treatment. Page after page of lives destroyed by the company that bore his name. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, but it rang before he could dial. "Mr. Sterling?" Dr. Chen's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I'm calling about Amara Jackson. Her insurance claim has been denied again. 3rd time. The review board cited insufficient documentation despite having over 400 pages of medical records." "That's impossible. I personally called the head of claims. Your personal call apparently doesn't carry much weight with your own company's algorithms." The doctor's words were surgical in their precision. "Mr. Sterling, I've been practicing oncology for 12 years. I've never seen claim denials this systematic or this cruel. It's almost as if someone programmed the system to target the most vulnerable patients." The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. Someone had programmed it that way. his own board of directors, maximizing profits by betting that desperate people wouldn't have the resources to fight extended legal battles against corporate teams. That afternoon, Sterling called an emergency board meeting. The conference room on the 42nd floor had witnessed countless decisions that shaped the New York skyline, but it had never seen its CEO arrive with the kind of cold fury that now radiated from Richard Sterling. "Gentlemen," he began, placing the investigator's report on the polished table, "we need to discuss Meridian Health Insurance." Board Chairman Harold Morrison barely looked up from his phone. "Meridian's been our most profitable subsidiary for 3 years running, outstanding performance metrics. Outstanding at killing people." Sterling's voice was ice. "We've denied cancer treatment to over 1,200 patients in the past 5 years. 47 of them have died." The room fell silent. Morrison finally looked up, his expression shifting from boredom to concern. "Richard, you seem upset about something that's simply good business." "Good business?" Sterling's composure cracked. "Harold, we're murdering people for quarterly earnings reports." "That's an extremely dramatic characterization," Morrison replied smoothly. "Insurance companies assess risk. Some claims don't meet our criteria for approval. That's not personal, it's actuarial. Show me the criteria for denying Amara Jackson's claim." Morrison's assistant, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Wells, consulted her tablet. Subject 1247, experimental treatment protocol, insufficient peer-reviewed data, patient demographic suggests high default risk on payment plans. Patient demographic? Sterling's voice was dangerously quiet. Single African-American female, low-income, high-stress occupation. Statistics show this demographic has poor treatment compliance and high mortality rates regardless of intervention. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sterling realized with crystalline clarity that he wasn't just looking at corporate callousness, he was witnessing systematic racism disguised as business policy. "Get out." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry?" Morrison looked genuinely confused. "All of you, get out of my building. Security will escort you to your offices to collect personal items. Your termination paperwork will be ready within the hour." Morrison stood up slowly, his face flushing red. "Richard, you can't be serious." "I've been with this company for 15 years. 15 years of turning human suffering into profit margins." Sterling pressed the intercom button. "Security to the executive conference room, immediately." "You're having some kind of breakdown," Patricia Wells interjected. "This emotional response to routine business decisions suggests you need psychiatric evaluation. The only thing sick in this room is a system that reduces human beings to demographic risk assessments." Sterling's voice rose with each word. "You want to know about patient 1247? Her name is Amara Jackson. She's a Lincoln Center prima ballerina who served champagne to pay for her daughter's education while fighting cancer. She's dying because you programmed computers to bet against the lives of people who look like my mother." The security team arrived as Morrison was gathering his papers. "This isn't over, Richard. The shareholders won't stand for this kind of erratic behavior. You're destroying everything we've built." "Good," Sterling replied. "It deserves to be destroyed." After the board members were escorted out, Sterling sat alone in the conference room, staring out at the Manhattan skyline his company had helped shape. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Mom collapsed at home. We're back at Mount Sinai, room 3114. He found them 3 hours later. Amara was unconscious, connected to machines that monitored her failing body with electronic precision. Sophie sat beside her, holding her mother's hand and speaking in whispers about Columbia, about the future, about dreams that might never be realized. "The doctors say her body is shutting down," Sophie said without looking up. "The delay in treatment, it gave the cancer too much time." Sterling felt something break inside his chest. "I fired the entire board today, every person responsible for denying her claims." Will that bring her back? The question hit him like a physical blow. All his wealth, all his power, all the systemic changes he could implement, none of it could undo the damage already done. No, he admitted, but maybe it will save the next person. That night, Sterling didn't go home to his penthouse. He slept in the hospital chair, holding vigil with Sophie. Sometime around 3 a.m., Amara's eyes fluttered open. "Richard?" Her voice was barely audible. "You're still here." "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled weakly. "Sophie told me what you did, firing the board." "It wasn't enough. It's too late. It's never too late to do the right thing." Amara's fingers found his hand. "My grandmother used to say that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about making sure the future looks different." As dawn broke over the East River, painting the hospital walls in shades of gold and pink, Richard Sterling understood that some truths could only be learned at the bedside of someone you'd failed to save. The woman whose life he'd helped destroy was teaching him how to build something better from the ruins of his own cruelty. Amara Jackson died on a Thursday morning in November, when the first snow of winter was beginning to dust the windows of Mount Sinai Hospital. She slipped away quietly at 6:23 a.m., holding Sophie's hand on one side and Richard's on the other. Her final words a whispered, "Take care of each other." The funeral 3 days later was unlike anything Manhattan had ever seen. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine overflowed with an impossible mixture of humanity. Lincoln Center dancers stood beside Bronx cleaning ladies, tech billionaires wept next to food service workers, and Harvard professors shared pews with high school dropouts. The viral video had made Amara a symbol, but her death had made her something more. A bridge between worlds that rarely acknowledged each other's existence. Sophie delivered the eulogy with a composure that broke hearts across the packed cathedral. She spoke of a mother who had danced through poverty, who had found grace in humiliation, who had taught her that true strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up with dignity intact. "My mother believed that everyone deserves to be seen," Sophie said, her voice carrying to the cathedral's soaring arches. "Not judged by their uniform or their zip code or the color of their skin, but seen for who they really are inside." She spent her last months showing us that transformation is possible, that even the most broken systems can be rebuilt with love. Richard sat in the front pew, Sophie's chosen family, despite the complexity of their relationship. The past month had been a whirlwind of legal battles as he restructured Sterling Industries, firing executives, changing policies, and establishing a foundation in Amara's name. But none of it felt like enough in the face of this loss. After the service, as mourners gathered in the parish hall sharing memories and comfort food, Sophie found him standing alone by a window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. "She forgave you, you know," Sophie said quietly, joining him at the window. "At the end, when the morphine wasn't working and the pain was terrible, she still said you were a good man who had gotten lost. She believed you found your way back." "I don't know if I deserve that forgiveness. Maybe that's not up to you to decide." Sophie turned to face him, and Richard was struck by how much she looked like her mother. The same determined chin, the same eyes that saw straight through pretense to truth. "What matters is what you do with it." 6 months later, the Sarah Mae Washington Community Center reopened its doors in the heart of the Bronx. The renovated building gleamed with new floors, updated equipment, and a state-of-the-art dance studio where a bronze plaque read, "In memory of Amara Jackson, who taught us that everyone deserves to dance." Richard stood at the back of the room, watching 75 children from the neighborhood take their first tango lesson from guest instructor Carlos Morales, formerly of the Buenos Aires National Company. The kids giggled and stumbled through the basic steps, but their joy was infectious. "Mr. Sterling, A small voice tugged at his jacket. He looked down to find Maria Santos, age 8, her dark eyes bright with excitement. "Miss Sophie says you're the one who saved our dance class." "I think your dance class saved me," he replied honestly. The center had become his second home over the past months. He taught financial literacy on Tuesday evenings, helped with homework on Thursdays, and spent Saturdays working alongside community members to maintain the building. It was work that would never appear in Forbes magazine, but it was the most meaningful of his life. Sophie had deferred Columbia for a year, choosing instead to establish the Amara Jackson Foundation, which provided emergency medical assistance to families facing insurance denials. At 18, she had become a formidable advocate, testifying before congressional committees about healthcare inequality and corporate responsibility. "The foundation approved another 100 cases this month," she told Richard during one of their weekly dinners. "Mrs. Patterson from 143rd Street starts radiation tomorrow, and little Jerome Williams gets his surgery next week. Your mother would be proud. She'd be proud of you, too. You know that, right?" Richard wasn't sure he believed that yet, but he was learning that healing happened in small, daily choices rather than grand gestures. Every insurance claim he personally reviewed, every child he helped with homework, every time he chose empathy over efficiency, it all felt like a conversation with Amara's memory. The real test came 8 months after her death, when Sterling Industries faced its biggest hostile takeover attempt in company history. Morrison and the fired board members had aligned with international investors who promised to restore profitable efficiency to the company's operations. The shareholders' meeting was held at the Javits Center, with over 2,000 investors in attendance and millions more watching the live stream. Morrison took the podium first, presenting charts that showed declining profits since Richard's emotional restructuring of company policies. "Richard Sterling has allowed personal relationships to compromise his fiduciary responsibility," Morrison declared. "The Jackson incident triggered an irrational response that has cost shareholders over $40 million in revenue." When Richard's turn came to speak, he walked to the podium carrying a single photograph, Amara in her Lincoln Center costume, radiant with the joy of someone living her dream. "Harold Morrison just referred to a human being as an incident," Richard began, his voice carrying clearly through the massive hall. "This woman's name was Amara Jackson. She was a prima ballerina, a devoted mother, a veteran's widow, and someone who showed me what courage actually looks like." The hall fell silent as Richard's words found their mark. "You want to talk about fiduciary responsibility? Let me tell you what I've learned about the real cost of the policies we used to embrace. 47 people died because we prioritized profit margins over human life. How do you calculate the shareholder value of a mother's life? What's the return on investment of a child growing up without their parent?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Richard pressed on. "Sterling Industries generated record profits last year, not despite our new policies, but because of them. When you treat employees with dignity, productivity increases. When you serve communities instead of exploiting them, brand loyalty follows. When you build trust instead of extracting maximum value, long-term growth becomes sustainable." He held up the photograph of Amara. "This woman taught me that true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up. The hostile takeover you're being asked to support represents everything she spent her life fighting against. The choice is yours, but understand what you're really voting for." The vote wasn't even close. Morrison's takeover failed by a margin of 73 to 27%, with shareholders choosing transformation over extraction, community building over asset stripping. That evening, Richard found himself back at Riverside Park, sitting on the bench where Amara had told him about his mother. Sophie joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cart they'd patronized together dozens of times over the past year. "She would have loved today," Sophie said, settling beside him on the bench. "Watching you stand up to Morrison, seeing the shareholders choose the right path. Mom always said that people are basically good when they're given the chance to be." Snow was beginning to fall again, each flake catching the light from the street lamps like tiny dancers. The river flowed dark and steady beside them, carrying the city's secrets toward the sea. "I have something to ask you," Richard said quietly. "I know it's complicated given everything that's happened, but these past months, working together, getting to know you, I was wondering if you'd let me adopt you, officially." Sophie was quiet for so long that Richard began to worry he'd overstepped, pushed too hard for a connection that maybe existed only in his own healing heart. "My mother used to say that family isn't just about blood," Sophie said finally. "It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love you even when it's difficult." She turned to look at him directly. "You showed up, Richard, even when it was hard, even when you didn't know how. You kept showing up. Mom saw that. I see it too." As they sat together on the park bench, watching snow transform the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful, Richard Sterling understood that redemption wasn't a destination you arrived at, but a dance you learned to do one step at a time. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played jazz that drifted through the winter air like a prayer for second chances. In our golden years, we often find ourselves invisible to a world that values youth and productivity over wisdom and experience. Like Amara Jackson, many of us have been reduced to what we do rather than celebrated for who we are. We've raised children, built careers, survived losses, and accumulated decades of stories that seem to matter less in a society obsessed with the next big thing. But Amara's journey reminds us that our true worth was never determined by others' recognition. Every time we've gotten back up after life knocked us down, every moment we've chosen grace over bitterness, every day we've continued loving despite being overlooked, these are the dances that define our legacy. The beauty isn't in being seen by everyone, it's in refusing to become invisible to ourselves. Our experience, our resilience, our capacity for forgiveness and wisdom, these aren't consolation prizes for aging. They're the very qualities this world desperately needs. Like Richard Sterling's transformation, it's never too late to begin again, to matter, to make a difference that echoes beyond our years. What moment in your life did you have to choose between bitterness and grace? And how did that choice shape who you became? Have you ever felt invisible in a crowd? And what helped you remember your own worth? Share your story below. Your experience matters more than you know.